In almost every corner of the economy today, there is the unspoken understanding that this can't go on forever, right? We have almost doubled our national debt in the span of 6 years and are now paying more than $1 trillion a year in interest alone. Consumers have evaporated their savings and filled the gap with short-term debt. We are fixing the housing crisis by just making it easier to take on more debt and betting whatever is left on a market that is overly optimistic, to put it generously. Almost everybody acknowledges that these systems are overdue for some kind of correction, but at the same time, nobody is exactly volunteering to pay the accrued costs. A balanced budget sounds nice until it means tax hikes and gutting government programs. Everybody loves the idea of affordable housing until it's their house that's becoming affordable, and consumers have basically become a protected species that must not be interfered with. If we know this can't go on forever, the next best question is, how long can it go on for? And does extending and pretending that these issues can be delayed indefinitely only make their inevitable comeuppance even worse?
If you are looking to buy a home, big changes could be on the way. In a social media post, President Trump floated the idea of a 50-year mortgage.
Now we get word from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that credit card delinquencies are at a 15-year high.
According to Bank of America Merrill Lynch and a fund survey they did, the NASDAQ is considered the most crowded trade right now, maybe in the world. Everybody is out of the long dollar trade and into buying tech stock.
During the pandemic, Americans were able to save more money because they were spending less, obviously, due to the lockdown restrictions.
Kind of a simple starting point is one tariff comes in that gets passed along in prices and raises inflation, but it's just a one-time thing. So the price level goes up, and that's it.
What does this mean for you and your money?
For as long as most of you have been alive, we have been told that federal debt is a major crisis just waiting to happen. For more than a quarter of a century at this point, we've become very well acquainted with the images of this debt clock and the increasingly regular government shutdowns where they play hot potato with this ballooning hand grenade. If all of that wasn't annoying enough, there is almost the uniform flip-flop between politicians taking turns to be very concerned about fiscal responsibility depending on if they are in or out of power at that time. It's a powerful message, but they do seem to forget about it pretty quickly once they are in office, and fixing it would require actual sacrifice. And if we are being honest with ourselves, it's almost easy to see where this indifference is coming from. We were told we were at an inflection point when we crossed $10 trillion in debt, and then $20 trillion, and now we are approaching $40 trillion in debt, or 130% of our GDP. The rate in which we are taking on new debt is also accelerating. Almost half of all of our outstanding borrowing has been done in just the last 6 years. And yet, on the surface, you would be forgiven for thinking, not much has changed. And I don't just mean that in the sense of, why haven't we turned into Greece yet? Because this also raises a more important question. The government has spent $15 trillion more than it has brought in taxes in just the last half-decade alone. So why don't we feel $15 trillion richer? When will this debt actually become a problem? So the federal government has a massive amount of debt that has really only been trending in one direction, and there are ultimately only 6 options we have to deal with it. We can grow our way out of it, we can inflate our way out of it, we can raise taxes, cut spending, turn into Japan, or continue to kick the can down the road. So far, politicians have been promising this first option, while overwhelmingly relying on this last option, and it's important to understand the fundamentals of why we can't keep on doing this, because it's worked out pretty well for us so far, right? As of the time of making this video, the USA has never defaulted on its debt repayments, although it has gotten shockingly close on an increasingly frequent number of occasions. But to be fair, a lot of these near misses were crises of our own creation. It sounds dumb, and to be honest, it is dumb. But not many people actually understand the real mechanics of, well, how this money actually works. You may be under the misconception that the national debt has been ticking up every second of every day since we last ran our budget surplus back in 2002. Sensationalist media reporting and iconography like this debt clock certainly haven't helped with that understanding. But as an example, our national debt actually shrunk ever so slightly between Q4 of 2024 and Q2 of 2025. This was because prior to this, the debt ceiling was suspended, effectively taking the self-imposed cap off how much the government could borrow. When that suspension ended on the 1st of January 2025, the debt ceiling came back into effect and the government found itself already at its credit limit. To fill this gap, the government mostly just used the money it had sitting around in the Treasury General account. There are some technicalities, but really this is effectively just the checking account for the federal government. It's a big bank account held with the Fed that taxes and other federal receipts like tariffs go into, and all of the expenses of the government, including debt repayments, come out of. The Treasury Department releases a daily report of everything that goes into this account and everything that comes out of it, so you are welcome to balance the government's checkbook. Currently, there is over $900 billion sitting in this account, a near record high outside of major events around the pandemic. When the debt ceiling was reintroduced last year and we temporarily couldn't expand the debt, we spent down this account from just over $800 billion to less than $300 billion over 6 months, including a bit of a boost from April tax receipts. Today, the debt ceiling has been increased again to $41.1 trillion, after the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act added $5 trillion to our credit limit back in July last year. In the 3 months that followed that, we had already added an additional $1.4 trillion to the debt, with some of this extra money going towards topping this account back up. Now, it's important to understand these basic financial mechanics, because one of the most immediate risks that lenders are afraid of is what happens if the government doesn't raise the debt ceiling and we run out of money in this account. We have actually come incredibly close 3 times in just the last 15 years. In 2011, there was political brinkmanship over reducing the deficit. In 2013, it was the same threat used to push back against the Affordable Care Act. And in 2023, Congress once again demanded a cutback in government spending, or else it would refuse to lift the limit. At the climax of this standoff, the Treasury had less than $40 billion left in its account. Even after taking extraordinary measures like delaying payments towards pension accounts, there was less than 48 hours of regular spending before the Treasury just simply wouldn't have anything left to fund the government or pay back its lenders. Now, threatening to push the government into default in the name of fiscal responsibility is a little bit like refusing to pay back your credit card because you are starting a new budget. The real reason the government plays this dumb game so much is because it's a good way for Congress to threaten the president. These stunts have had real consequences, because while theoretically the US can technically always cover its debt by printing more of its own money, we have demonstrated that we might eventually choose not to over political squabbles. The longer we can keep kicking the can down the road, the more dangerous these games become. Shaking the Jenga tower gets riskier and riskier the higher we stack it. Playing chicken with a debt half the size of our GDP wasn't a great idea to begin with. Playing the same games with the debt level we have today has had real consequences even if it wasn't an outright collapse. Following the standoff in 2023, our credit rating was downgraded by Fitch from a perfect AAA to a AA+, meaning that federal borrowing was no longer seen as completely risk-free, and since then we have only been downgraded further still. To put things into perspective, US federal debt is now rated similarly or even lower than a lot of mortgage-backed securities were back in 2007, which obviously sounds bad. But it's time to learn how money works to find out why this hasn't become a crisis yet, and how we could fix it before it does. This video is sponsored by Mint Mobile, a wireless company that is all about keeping things simple and affordable. Mint reimagined the whole wireless shopping experience and made it easy and online. There are no stores and no salespeople, so you skip the confusing hoops most carriers put you through. Every plan runs through the nation's largest 5G network, with unlimited talk and text, free calling to Mexico, Canada, and the UK, and hotspot included on unlimited plans. It is premium wireless without the premium price tag, with plans starting at $15 a month. What stood out to me was how easy switching actually is. I kept my phone number activated with eSIM in minutes from home, and the service has been fast and reliable everywhere I've used it. Mint also lets you pay your way. You can buy in bulk with 3, 6, or 12-month plans, so the more months you buy up front, the more you save. And you can pick the data you actually need instead of overpaying for one-size-fits-all. You can bring your own phone or grab a new one and keep your number either way. And if Mint is not for you, every plan comes with a 7-day money-back guarantee. Stop overpaying for wireless just because that is how it has always been. Premium plans start at $15 a month at Mint. Click the link in my description or scan the QR code on screen to make the switch. So the actual risk of people holding US debt never getting their money back is effectively zero, because at the end of the day, we can ask the Fed to just print more cash. But even a small pause in repayments is an indication that the government might not have this whole situation under control. And since so many systems in the global economy rely on using treasuries as effectively an immutable cash flow generator, any uncertainty casts doubt over a lot more than just getting an interest payment a few days late. The risk to bondholders is not that they won't get the money back that they were promised. Even if it is delayed, they will get their money back. The real risk is that by the time they do, the money they receive won't be worth it anymore, either because it's been inflated away or because nobody wants to use US dollars anymore. If treasuries can't be relied on as the foundation of global financial plumbing, that is just one thing that could undermine the expected future value. Another risk is that US dollars themselves won't be in demand if America becomes a less dominant middleman in the global economy. Which, well, I mean, yeah, that's clearly not an unfounded concern. All these potential future problems means that lenders want to see higher returns to compensate them for these risks. When the Treasury borrows money, it effectively runs a reverse auction. It says it needs a certain amount of money and promises a higher and higher rate until people agree to give them that money. In recent months, as more groups have been looking to diversify away from the increasingly questionable dollar, these auctions have gone on for a lot longer than we have been used to, and we have had to offer a lot more interest than we did in the past, on top of interest rates that have also risen. As more and more of our debt is rolled over onto these higher rates, the total amount of money that we are dedicating just to covering interest has almost tripled within the last 5 years alone. And unfortunately, that in turn presents a risk to investors who want even higher rates to compensate them for risks posed by higher interest rates. We have actually spent a similar portion of our GDP on interest payments in the past, but that was back in the 1980s when interest rates were as high as 19%. The only thing that made this possible was the fact that our total debt was a lot lower, so even a much higher rate didn't cost as much as today. The total debt burden that we are carrying around now means that just a 1% increase in interest rates will carve more than 1% of our GDP in repayments. If we really are just going to try and kick the can down the road, the number one most important thing we can do is to make sure that road is as smooth as possible. But since we seem utterly incapable of doing that, maybe we should explore some other options. The best option would be to grow our way out of the debt, and politicians in particular love this idea because it is theoretically the option that requires the least sacrifice. If you have $20,000 of credit card debt and you make minimum wage, well, that's a major problem. But the same debt for someone making $250,000 a year is much less of a concern. By working off that same basic assumption, if we grow our economy faster than the debt, we can keep things under control. The reason this is such a popular idea is because economic growth is an objective in the first place, and if it lets us handwave away another problem, that is even better. No politician really wants to run on the idea of sacrifice in hard times, so they go full Wolf of Wall Street and propose dealing with your problems by getting rich. Now, to be fair, our debt to GDP ratio has actually shrunk over the last 5 years from a pandemic high of 132% down to about 121% today. It's still not great, but it is at least showing that the economy is growing faster than the debt, right? Well, yes, that's actually true. But there are 3 problems with this simple assumption. The first is that we are measuring economic growth and debt from the starting point of the pandemic when the economy was locked down and we took out massive loans to fund big stimulus programs. The second is that by zooming out and observing a more long-term trend, it becomes clear that outside of this little anomaly, we are still overwhelmingly trending in the wrong direction. And finally, this is just measuring the total debt, not how much we actually need to pay on it. To use the same analogy again, $20,000 in credit card debt is a lot worse than a $20,000 mortgage, and that's because of the interest rate. Because lenders are demanding higher rates from the Treasury in conjunction with a higher cash rate from the Fed, we are now paying around 4% of our GDP in interest payments alone. A 4% GDP growth rate would be considered extremely good, and we would need to achieve that every year, year after year, just to compensate for the interest payments now. In reality, since the year 2000, we have actually achieved an average annual growth rate of around 3%, and compared to a lot of other countries, we are actually doing pretty well. So with this much money going to interest alone, just growing our way out of the debt ain't going to cut it anymore. Another option is something that actually seems pretty logical. Fire up the money printers and inflate our way out of it. Treasuries have a nominal face value, and most have fixed interest rates, with only the exception of a measly $2 trillion worth of outstanding inflation-protected securities. If we have the value of our money, we could effectively half the value of our debt. If you took out $1 million fixed interest loan in Zimbabwe before hyperinflation, you would have been able to turn around a year later, sell a loaf of bread, and pay off your debt 1,000 times over with the proceeds. Now, it doesn't need to go that far, but if we let our inflation run higher than average for a few years, it could bring down the real value of this debt. The problem is that this only really works once. To lenders, this is almost the same thing as default. Remember, their only real risk is that the money they get back from holding these bonds isn't worth what they were expecting it to be when they bought it. Sustained inflation would help to reduce the burden of the current outstanding bonds we have, but next time the Treasury goes to borrow more money, investors are going to demand even higher rates to compensate them for the falling value of the dollar over time. Higher than expected inflation compared to other economies could also further undermine the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Not to mention wreak havoc on regular people who are already suffering from a cost of living crisis. The inflate away our problems by just printing more money does sound simple in theory, but it will almost certainly do more harm than good. So, that only leaves us with some of the less fun paths forward. The simplest solution of all would be to do what anybody would suggest if you have a debt problem. Make more money and spend less of what you make. In government speak, raise taxes and cut spending. Now, we tried to cut back in spending starting around this time last year, and overall, it did not go great. Unfortunately, a lot of our spending is not discretionary. So without fundamentally reshaping the rules around pensions or healthcare, the government can't directly control how much it spends in these categories. Outside of that, the largest expense category is just the interest on our debt, and without defaulting, we are stuck with that too. The military is the next big expense, and this is something we could change, but there are two problems with that, especially right now. The first problem is that we have actually increased our military spending as we have simultaneously decided to become more isolationist and interventionist at the same time. Now, we don't need another armchair general, but the second problem is something much more within our wheelhouse. Military recruitment is way up, which may be a sign of people wanting to do their patriotic duty. But it also may be a sign that young people, and in particular young men, couldn't find a job anywhere else. Cutting military funding right now could expose some major holes in other parts of the economy.
We're investing that record number of dollars, have no choice, in the United States Armed Forces. Also creating a lot of jobs, but we're not even doing it for that reason.
So, alright, maybe we just raise taxes, right? The One Big Beautiful Bill was one of the largest sweeping tax cuts ever, especially for higher income earners and asset owners, so that probably wasn't a step in the right direction down this particular path. But would it even matter? Total federal receipts, as in how much the government receives in tax and all other forms of revenue, as a share of GDP has been remarkably consistent since the end of the Second World War. Even during the 50s and 60s, when we were taxing top income earners as much as 90%, the total revenue we brought in was comparatively identical to today. The problem is, since then and now, the spending of the federal government has almost doubled. We just have more programs, commitments, and expenses, so this data does on the surface support the idea that taxes alone aren't going to fix this, right? Well, that is true, but it's often used to redirect away from the issue of taxation entirely. We still tax comparatively little compared to most of our economic peers, and who is paying those taxes has changed considerably even if the end result has stayed consistent over time. According to IRS statistics, the burden of this revenue has shifted largely onto middle-income earners and away from wealthy asset owners. These are very taxing taxes that impact people with the highest propensity to spend, work, and reinvest when possible, which means this tax shift is likely also shifting the very same economic growth that we are still hoping could grow us out of our problems. On the flip side, a lot of the extra government spending that we are doing is flowing more directly to private enterprises through grants, contracts, credits, subsidies, bailouts, rebates, partnerships, and guarantees. That additional spending going to private institutions is captured and passed along to private shareholders. Of course, this still happened in the past, but the rate at which it is happening has increased. The economist Richard Vague has actually tracked this data and found an almost perfect inverse relationship between net government spending and net household income, with an increasing share of that income going to the top percentiles. So these asset owners have benefited from an increase in government spending while simultaneously contributing less to overall stagnant government revenue. This is a lot of words to say what you probably already knew, which is that wealthy asset owners and companies can afford to pay more taxes, which should help to bridge this widening gap and potentially take some pressure off workers who have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Put even more simply, we know that wealthy institutions and individuals can afford to finance our current budget deficit, because they already are financing our budget deficit. Through their investment funds, depository institutions, or just private holdings, these groups are collectively by far the largest net purchasers of government debt, with the exception of open market operations by the Fed and intra-government debt. If they can find the money to purchase bonds, they can find the money to pay taxes. Now, the final road that we could go down is ending up like Japan. Low growth, low inflation, and low interest rates to safely contain a volatile pool of debt. This is clearly not ideal, especially for asset owners that won't get to enjoy the line going up year after year on average, but it could be a last-ditch parachute to avoid a wider crisis in the meantime. Now, of course, the tragic reality is that we aren't going to do any of this until we have no other options, because it's easier and far more popular to just make the future someone else's problem. Of course, kicking that can down the road only works if the rest of the economy keeps running smoothly enough to absorb it, and that is a much bigger assumption than it used to be. We are always told that the economy is like a fine piece of clockwork. Everything has to fit perfectly in order, and even one small change can have second or third order consequences that could be devastating. Like that time a small tweak of banking regulations directly led to the biggest economic downturn we have seen since the Great Depression, or that random day a small adjustment in a foreign currency wiped trillions of dollars off the market. These were obviously important disruptions to a delicate system, but none of this is even meant to be some kind of partisan attack either. Some of these things, like student loans, eventually needed to be dealt with, but no matter what side of the fence you personally sit on, it should be pretty clear that things are very turbulent right now. If the economy is supposed to run like a fine Swiss watch, then we have been adjusting it with a jackhammer. But yet, it's still going. Over the same time, the economy still grew, unemployment remained relatively low, incomes went up, and the market, which is supposed to hate instability, is hovering around all-time highs. Now, yes, of course, there is a lot of nuance to these metrics and measures that gloss over some real problems. But that's actually exactly the point. There have been plenty of far less compromised economies that have folded under less pressure. With the sheer volume and severity of shakeups that have been hitting us, it does raise the logical question: why hasn't the economy collapsed yet? So the first thing you are probably thinking is the same thing we have covered extensively on this channel over the last year. AI spending is just making the big numbers look good. Yes, there are real structural issues in the economy, but the mountains of cash that tech companies are spending on AI infrastructure development has done a landlord special and painted over all of those cracks. Things are still rotting away out of sight, but on the surface, everything looks good enough. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, our GDP was growing at a rate of 4.3% when annualized in Q3 of 2025. We don't have the figures yet for Q4, but without some kind of major surprise dragging the entire year down, these numbers look really good. But well, yeah. The trillions of dollars going towards data center construction and computer chips are now contributing more to this growth than consumer spending. Not a great sign in the biggest consumer market in the world, but you probably already knew this. What might be surprising though is that according to the BLS themselves, overall investment in the economy actually decreased ever so slightly in the third quarter, bringing down the net growth figure overall. So how is it possible that investment is single-handedly keeping the economy alive while also being practically insignificant in the overall economy? Well, because this is a net figure. AI spending alone would contribute about 2.5%, but that spending is being completely offset by companies slowly selling down their own inventory. When a business or person buys inventory or some kind of other produced asset, it gets counted as a positive investment, but when they sell it, it's subtracted from that same category. This is how statisticians avoid counting the same thing twice if, for example, a machine shop made a part in one quarter, kept it in storage for a little while, and then sold that part to a customer in the next quarter. Only one part has actually been produced, so only the final price should be counted. What businesses have overwhelmingly been doing over the last year is selling off stuff they filled their warehouses with before all of the tariff shenanigans really got started. A decline in inventory has almost perfectly offset an increase in spending done by AI. So if that spending suddenly stopped, then things would suddenly look a lot worse than they do right now. However, that's still not the whole story. We will get to consumer spending soon enough. But before that, government spending and our own balance of trade also, almost inexplicably, look really good too. Government spending is up because the net impact of DOGE cuts was effectively negligible, and we are also spending more on the military, so that's simple enough. But trade deserves some special attention because the numbers alone are a bit unintuitive. A reduction in imports is actually good for GDP, and according to the data, we are simultaneously exporting more and importing less at the same time, which raises the uncomfortable question: are the tariffs actually working? Well, spoiler alert, no. Okay, so yes, we are importing less stuff into America right now because tariffs have disrupted business spending and because those same businesses loaded up on stock at the beginning of the year and are just burning through their supplies. It's not exactly the success story of everybody suddenly deciding to buy American after a tariff got slapped on the imported alternatives because, well, often there is no American alternative. So that's not great, but at least we are exporting more stuff, right? Well, exports have indeed increased, which sounds shocking considering that we have really been testing our trade relationships. But it becomes a little less shocking when you realize what we have been exporting. The fastest growing category by far is precious metals. From October 2024 to October 2025, total exports grew by $26 billion after accounting for inflation. Of that number, $14 billion was just from increased gold exports, a 517% increase from the year before. Now, partially this was because each ounce of gold we sold was worth a lot more, but that price appreciation was largely thanks to everybody trying to diversify away from the US dollar to a reserve asset, so I don't exactly know if we could call that a win. Even adjusting for the price, we have still just exported more gold in total to wealth safe havens like Switzerland and London. On top of this, an additional $4 billion in export growth was from increased silver exports, representing year-on-year growth of 2,800%. Meaning that out of a $26 billion increase in exports, $18 billion is just because we are selling more silver and gold, and the remaining $8 billion has largely come from military and energy exports. So yeah, our balance of trade looks good because everybody is too scared to stock up on inventory and we are selling off our precious metals. By the numbers alone, our economy looks healthy. But this is kind of like saying that you have improved your household's financial position because you have been living off your supply of canned beans, and you sold your car, and your kidney. For now, the cash flow looks great, but you can't really keep doing that forever. Now, maybe it's a bit hyperbolic to call this a going out of business sale, but other countries trying to pull fungible stores of wealth out of America as quickly as possible is generally not a great sign. But it gets worse. Strong growth in consumer spending is generally a good sign that things aren't going too badly, because normally people don't spend more money unless they are making more money, or are confident that they can stretch their budgets a little bit more. From the data, we can see that even with all of the funny business going on in these four other categories, consumer spending still makes up a majority of the net contributions towards GDP growth. But there are some other caveats. The first is, well, yep, you guessed it, you are probably sick of hearing me say it by now. But a record amount of that spending is being done by just the wealthiest households, meaning that this growth isn't necessarily a sign that all consumers are feeling confident, and is more of a sign that wealthy people have enjoyed highly appreciated assets. But for the sake of this question alone, that actually doesn't matter. If the economy was seriously hurt by any of this turbulence, or even if these households thought the economy would be hurt, we would still normally expect them to reduce their spending as their businesses failed, their bonuses shrunk, or their investments faltered. But they aren't. If anything, they are actually spending too recklessly, resulting in a record number of very high-income households getting themselves into financial difficulty. It might be really dumb for the individuals, but it does mean that businesses have been very comfortable producing lots of goods and services, even if they are increasingly catering just to the wealthy. So maybe the rumors of our impending demise were greatly exaggerated after all, right? Well, you probably should have seen it coming at this point. But let's take a look at a good number and explain why it's actually a bad number. Most of the growth in this consumer spending came from healthcare and other non-durable goods, which the BLS notes was primarily made up of pharmaceuticals. It's no secret that insurance and prescription prices have gone up for most households, but these measures are supposed to account for those price increases and just look at the actual services being provided. So there are actually three things that have been driving this extra output from the healthcare industry. The first is simply that we just need more healthcare. An industry report by McKinsey generally summed it up that Americans were on average getting older, fatter, sicker, and less engaged with their health. The second factor was the growth in offerings like GLP-1 drugs that have driven a lot of demand for pharmaceuticals. And the third variable is simply that a lot of people are afraid that they are going to be pushed off of their health insurance plans in the coming months, so they are in a bit of use it before they lose it situation. But in the short term, all of this activity has contributed to consumer spending because healthcare and pharmaceuticals are really expensive and really hard to say no to if you actually do need it. So hopefully all of this adds some relevant and slightly depressing nuance to an apparently red-hot economy. This economic growth is really good. There is no denying it. But a lot of the factors contributing to that growth are either not sustainable or not discretionary, and that's before we consider the biggest caveat of all. Our economy may have grown by around 4%. Again, depending on what Q4 results look like. But the US dollar has fallen by over 10% compared to most other major currencies. Now, it's not as simple as saying that this means we are really 6% worse off, but this kind of rapid currency depreciation quietly helps some of these figures look better than they should be right now, while simultaneously indicating some problems in the future. For example, the stock market has grown to record highs, which helps explain why wealthy households are still willing to do a lot of spending. But when denoted in most other currencies, the market has either traded flat or actually gone backwards slightly. This currency depreciation has also made our exports cheaper and imports more expensive, helping to explain the boost from both of these categories. A person that has seen their stock portfolio increase by 10% in a year might be happy to spend a little bit of extra cash. But when an overseas vacation or imported car is 10% more expensive, then some local alternatives suddenly look a lot better. Now, if we were actually a net exporting economy, this might actually help us out a little bit by making our exports more competitive in global markets. But unfortunately, we are the largest net importer on the planet, so what it will actually do is just make most things more expensive. This is also on top of the tariffs, which, according to a study conducted by the Kiel Policy Institute, have overwhelmingly been paid for by regular consumers. The report tracked the end price of 25 million transactions and found that foreign exporters were absorbing around 4% of the costs, with the remaining 96% being passed through to households. So yeah, individually we are importing less, while paying more for it. It's not great, but it still is not the collapse that a lot of pundits might have predicted. The reality is that it's just too early to tell. The American economy is not invincible, but it is both very large and very privileged. The size of our consumer and financial markets mean that things are not going to play out as quickly as they would in most other countries that are a lot easier for foreign institutions to move away from when things look risky. We also have some of the most widespread and entrenched agreements, alliances, partnerships, commitments, engagements, and even just good old understandings with almost every major other economy worth mentioning. These have all been tested, clearly, but no matter how hard we try, they won't fall apart overnight. Now, in the short term, that's good, because it means we have time to see things going wrong. But it also means that things will take a lot longer to get back if other countries, investors, and customers start trying to work around us rather than with us. But there is one big reason the rest of the world keeps coming back to us anyway. Nobody on the planet buys more stuff than we do. Americans are the best consumers on the planet, and it's really not even close. The runner-up is China, and they spend less than a third of what we do in any given year, even though they have almost 5 times as many people. It might not always feel like it, but by global standards, we are incredibly rich. We love buying shit, and we aren't afraid of going into debt to keep doing it. More of our economy depends on the consumption of goods and services than basically any other major country in the world. But this has to have a limit, right? As a direct result of our own insatiable desire to consume, our household savings rates are now the lowest they have ever been, and high-risk, high-interest consumer lending has surpassed $1 trillion. That doesn't include things like car loans, home loans, student loans, medical loans, or informal lending like buy now, pay later, which are also approaching all-time highs. So what is going to happen to the best consumers on the planet if they can't afford to consume anymore? And more importantly, could we solve all of our problems by just buying less shit? According to data from the World Bank, America is responsible for about a third of all consumer spending worldwide, even though we only represent 4% of the global population. According to the same report, consumer spending is now 69% of our total economy. For comparison, in the second largest consumer market in the world, China, consumption only accounts for 38% of their GDP. Now, that might be a bit of an unfair comparison. Outside of its major cities, China still has a lot of people who are very poor and don't buy things beyond the bare essentials. The European Union is a more comparable peer, but when counted as a single group, only 51% of their GDP is tied up in consumer spending, and as time goes on, they are spending less and less while we are spending more. By basically any metric, Americans are the best consumers on the planet, and this wasn't by accident. After the Second World War, America had a problem. The industrial juggernaut we had built up to fight the war in Europe and the Pacific no longer needed to make planes, tanks, ships, and munitions for the war effort. After the Great Depression, the government really didn't want to let these factories go idle, so it continued policies first pushed by the New Deal to encourage consumer spending to give those factories and their workers something to feed. The problem suddenly became that the market was saturated with goods and services, and there was presumably a limit to what people would buy. It was at this point that modern Mad Men-style advertising became a thing, as companies now needed to create demand rather than just catering to the demand that already existed. A not-so-fun fact is that a lot of the men that honed their craft creating propaganda for the First and Second World War pivoted to advertising where they could use their skills to sell products instead of selling the nation's war efforts. The historian Kenneth Jackson noted in his book Crabgrass Frontier that the year after the war ended, there were only 8 self-contained shopping centers in America. Most purchases were still done at local standalone stores that catered to the essentials for everyday life. Just 14 years later, though, at the start of the 1960s, there were over 4,000 shopping centers across the country, all vying for their sweet, sweet consumer dollars. At this time, most of the other major economies around the world had the more immediate problem of rebuilding their factories and infrastructure that were destroyed during the war. Only after that did they have to start worrying about what to do with their extra industrial output. This gave America a head start in consumerism that has been hard to catch up to. So that's the incredibly brief story about how we got here. But what does this actually mean for us today? Apart from creating a general culture of consumerism, the undermining of personal financial stability, corporate consolidation, resource depletion, and waste generation, there are three less obvious but more immediate problems that consumer-first economic policies have created, and two very important reasons why we can't really afford to get off the treadmill of consumption. The first problem we slowly created for ourselves is that consumerism made luxury, convenience, and experience cheap, but everyday life expensive. The optimization of industry, combined with globalized trade, finance, and shared expertise, has made consumer goods incredibly cheap by historical standards. Adjusted for inflation in the 1960s, an airline ticket from New York to Europe would cost $6,000, a fridge $4,000, a massive 21-inch color TV was almost $9,000, a home microwave oven produced by Raytheon was $5,000, and even modest home furnishings were worth the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today. Added together, these consumer goods and services that probably seem pretty basic to you were collectively worth as much as a house. That's because back then, consumer goods were luxuries, but housing was a pretty basic purchase. Today, global industry has made consumer goods extremely cheap, but constrained resources like land very expensive. You could go on an extended European vacation, buy the latest array of electronics and home appliances, and probably spend less than a few months' rent. All of these goods combined wouldn't add up to a down payment on a home in most cities, let alone an outright purchase. Now, hot take alert, but a lot of this stuff is actually pretty great. Fridges, washing machines, and modern computers do make our lives better and easier. Even modern services like, well, YouTube can be great if consumed in moderation. And I am not just saying that because I am a dirty, stinking, hypocritical creator. Modern conveniences have improved our lives, and if consumerism stopped there, we could probably have found a happy balance between cheap modern amenities without the trade-offs that came with it. But the problem was, it was almost impossible to stop it there. Building an economy on consumers meant we had to keep on consuming. It's the easy and trendy thing to write off consumerism as just a generically bad thing. So as much as I would love to make an easy video about how consuming modern goods and services is everything wrong with the world, there is a little bit more to it than that. A lot of things we consume genuinely increase our standard of living and quality of life. Somewhere between you leaving society behind to live off the land and taking out a buy now pay later loan for a Temu order is some happy medium of spending on consumer goods and services. Economists call this simple idea the law of diminishing marginal utility, where as consumption increases, the additional satisfaction or utility gain from each additional unit consumed falls. Normal humans just call it not overdoing things. And the strongest evidence to support the idea that we are overdoing things is that consumption is actually surprisingly equitable. According to data prepared by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the lowest quintile households spent approximately $1.37 trillion on personal consumption in 2022. The top 20% of households, on the other hand, spent just over $6 trillion. This still means that the wealthiest households are spending more than 4 times as much on consumer goods and services as the poorest households. But that's still relatively equal considering that the top 20% of households earn more than 14 times as much. So, what does this tell us? It shows that for most people, there is a basic level of consumption that is needed to live a normal life. And especially here in America, there are certain expenses that are really hard to avoid. According to the report, the biggest cost for most people was, unsurprisingly, housing. Housing can't be mass-produced in a factory on the other side of the world like most consumer goods, so it's become really expensive. We have already covered that problem. Transport was the other major cost for most households, as in most parts of the country, you need a car to get around, and for low-income households, that is a serious financial commitment. This can also be traced back to the consumer boom of post-war America as lobbying from the automobile industry to build car-friendly cities. And the mass adoption of remote single-family suburban developments meant that most of America was built around the car. The few East Coast cities that are either walkable or have reliable public transportation are unrealistically expensive for low-income households in other ways. So without a lot of sacrifices, most people are forced into owning a car. Personal spending on healthcare is also a uniquely American budget item that pushes up our numbers without really delivering results any different from those godless freedom-hating Europeans. Either way, it's easy to blame consumerism on consumers, but a lot of these expenses are extremely hard to avoid, even if people don't have the money to pay for it. According to the same report, this consumption of the bare essentials meant that the bottom 20% of households were spending $727 more than they made after tax every year. Now, you might be wondering, how can a household spend more money than it makes every single year? The answer is debt, of course, but also the people in the bottom 20% change every year. If someone loses their job and it takes them a while to get work again, they may end up in the bottom 20% temporarily until they find a new job and jump back up to whatever income bracket they were in before. This means that they will go through their savings or rack up debt to keep themselves functioning, but they should be able to recover once they are back on their feet. An inconvenient side effect of this consumer-driven debt is that people in debt also make for better, more motivated workers because they need to work or else. Studies by the National Institute of Health found that workers with high levels of debt were less likely to change jobs, more likely to work unpaid overtime, and less likely to make demands for better pay and benefits. Now, even if you are responsible with your borrowing, it can be really hard to maintain modern living standards as more of what we consume transitions to being subscription-based. Even if you do save diligently for purchases, sometimes it's not even possible to pay upfront anymore. So you need a regular income to make sure you can cover next month's round of automated deductions from your bank account, whether it can be from American Express, Netflix, Hulu, Afterpay, your student loans, car loans, AT&T, Adobe Creative Cloud, Microsoft Game Pass, Peloton, or if you are a true power consumer, all of them at once. If you lose your income for any reason, you don't actually own anything to tide you over, so it's a lot easier to fall behind a lot faster. Now, the bad news is that as jobs become less secure, regular layoffs become the corporate norm, and work becomes less formal, most people are going to experience this fun little financial roller coaster at some point in their life career. Data from the Fed showed that at the height of the pandemic-era stimulus, the fastest growing share of retail consumer spending came from low-income earners. This was simply because stimulus checks let them make purchases that they weren't able to afford before. Since then, growth in spending from high-income earners has more than doubled that of low-income earners. Companies have seen pandemic-era wealth accumulation and gone upmarket on most of their items, catering to the group of consumers that still has purchasing power. So if anybody really has the power to stop their consumption, it's high-income earners. And on an individual level, that's probably a really good idea. A report by the Wall Street Journal has found that the US economy as a whole now depends more on the spending habits of the top 10% than ever before, because they are the only ones that can reliably afford high-margin non-essentials. In such a consumer-centric economy, protecting those rich people who are the consumers becomes the most important objective, even though protecting workers would be a better long-term solution because better paid and more productive workers turn into consumers anyway. An alarming amount of extremely high-income earners are living paycheck to paycheck because companies have gotten so good at making sure that there is always something to purchase. Advertising and marketing have grown in line with consumer spending and now, by themselves, represent as much as 5% of GDP, and the formula has been perfected over the decades. So yeah, a pullback in consumption, especially imported low-quality goods, is probably a good idea as an individual, but on a nationwide level, it could get very scary. Our status as the biggest consumer market in the world gives us a lot of advantages. The reason that America has so many of the world's largest companies is because if you can scale a business to address the entire US market, it's already big enough to be globally dominant. And yeah, as dumb as the current trade wars might seem, we do have a lot of negotiating power because everybody wants access to our consumers. The American economy has been growing much faster than most countries in Europe, and even now most countries in Asia. But more of that than ever is just fueled by consumer spending of increasingly expensive goods and services. It doesn't help that a lot of this spending has been fueled by debt in some variety. Consumers are also fickle beings. Basing so much of our economy on highly indebted consumption means that if people get scared all at once about even the possibility of a recession and decide to be a little bit more careful with their money, that will cause a recession. Eventually, debt can only get us so far, and to be reliable consumers, we need reliable incomes. Unfortunately, the last real problem with this is that a growing share of this consumption is being provided by a rapidly shrinking share of suppliers, which is going to make issues like consumerism almost impossible to unravel. And the reason none of this gets fixed is because the people steering the ship are only thinking about next quarter's numbers. If you ever feel like the world has become incredibly focused on short-term results, that's probably not your imagination. People are living paycheck to paycheck, companies are being managed earnings report to earnings report, financial markets are waiting for the next interest rate movement, political decisions are being made for the next election cycle, entire industries have been created just to be sold to the next biggest investor, and all of this is being held together by loans that are being written to last just long enough to be bundled up into fixed income assets. This month, people were losing their minds, because for the first time since it was introduced, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did not publish its monthly jobs report because the household survey data could not be collected during the government shutdown. Now, this may be a sign of bigger issues under the surface, but the most immediate problem right now is that the Fed can't set interest rates without completely up-to-date information. These decisions should be made on long-term strategic plans, not noisy, and let's be honest, questionable month-to-month data. But a few things have changed, which for a lot of markets means that bad news is good news. A lot of people are actually hoping for more unemployment, because job losses force the Fed to lower interest rates, and lower interest rates means cheaper borrowing, and cheaper borrowing means debt-fueled speculation can go on a little longer. Now, if you think this is all a little bit dumb, that's because it is. But at the center of all of these issues, there is the question of, is our entire economy just surviving quarter to quarter? A report by Goldman Sachs found that more people than ever were living paycheck to paycheck. Now, I know that by itself, this is a trend that is not that surprising anymore. But it goes beyond this. More people than ever weren't even making it that far. Living paycheck to paycheck is a luxury compared to the new reality of living wage advanced to credit card bill. It's no secret that prices for everyday goods and services have increased by a lot in the last 5 years. But prices are a function of supply and demand itself is a function of what people are willing and able to purchase. Prices have only been able to stay this high because, for now at least, people have been able to afford it. But that ability has increasingly come from new and creative forms of debt. It's also no secret that the hottest new form of consumer debt bridging that gap is buy now pay later services. Now, these loans are technically not counted as official consumer debt for some reason, so the exact extent of their lending is hard to get precise data on. However, by all estimates, it's still in the hundreds of billions of dollars within America alone. Now, I am not bringing this up just to rant about inflation, consumers being stretched, or predatory buy now pay later systems. I have done that in plenty of separate videos. This industry is just one example of a bigger trend. The point here is that none of these buy now pay later companies make any money either. Most of them are still burning billions of dollars of investor money every year to gain market share, in a market that hasn't actually made any money yet. So, we have households who can't afford to pay upfront for basic purchases, being financed by an industry that can't afford to operate beyond the next quarter, without being supported by investor dollars. Investor dollars that are primarily coming from venture capital and private equity firms, who themselves are financed by a complicated network of debt and internal dealing, all of which is now showing questionable real returns. Now, bad businesses come and go all the time. That's the nature of capitalism. But what is different today, more than ever before, is that everybody involved in this string of failure is still making life-changing amounts of money. Founders and early employees are cashing out on their stock, private equity managers are making enormous bonuses, investors are enjoying returns that look good on paper, and regular people get to finance the burrito. Along this chain, nobody is actually making any money, but everybody is getting paid. Even if this whole industry implodes tomorrow, most of the insiders could walk away having made enough money that they will never need to work again. Taking short-term rewards at the expense of long-term objectives is just human nature. Our monkey brains need a lot of discipline to stop us from enjoying a little treat right now so that we can be in shape for summer 6 months away. In the past, these trade-offs were true in business as well. Long-term diligent saving, investing, and operating would be rewarded over short-term cash grabs. The problem is that we have allowed our market system to reward some people in the short term and place long-term consequences somewhere else entirely. Over the last 4 decades, there have been 3 distinct changes that have slowly altered economic incentives to favor surviving to the next quarter above all else. The worst thing about all of this, though, is just how easy it would be to change these incentives back. Now, maybe you think I have just picked a particularly egregious example of the buy now pay later industry. But this is just one symptom of a much larger and much more important trend. Everybody is just desperately trying to get theirs and get out. And you only need to look at the data to see the first reason why this has become the default business mentality. This is a chart of historic dividend yields from the S&P 500. There have been highs and lows, but for most of the market's history, it paid out roughly 4 to 5% and almost never less than 3%. This meant if you held $1 million portfolio with a mix of all of these companies, you could expect to be paid between $40,000 and $50,000 a year in dividends. Today, after a constant decades-long decline, that number is at an all-time low approaching just 1%. In plain English, what this means is that the only way that people are realistically getting money out of the stock market is by selling their stocks. Now, by itself, there isn't anything wrong with capital gains returns over dividend returns from an investing point of view. Both of my good friends Richard from the Plain Bagel and Ben Felix have done great deep dives on this. What's more is that individually, the tax rate on capital gains are lower than tax rates on earned income like dividends. So maybe this could just be written off as businesses looking out for their own shareholders. But all of these small incentives have created some questionable outcomes. Now, I know you are probably already uttering the words stock buybacks under your breath right now, and you would be absolutely right. If a company has made a lot of money at the end of the year, in the past, it only really had two options. The first was to just pay it out to their shareholders through a dividend. The second was to put that money back into the business to improve operations, work on R&D, or maybe even pay their employees a little bit better. Shareholders typically actually liked when companies did this, because theoretically, this reinvestment would grow the business or make it more dominant in its market, making their shares more valuable. But then in 1982, a law was changed that let companies cut out the middleman of reinvesting their cash into their business's fundamentals and instead let them just directly invest their cash right into their business's equity. Company management could take company money and use it to buy the company's own stock, which boosted the price. Now, by looking at this chart, you can see where that law was passed right here. Again, this video is not to pick on stock buybacks in particular, but it is instead to show how small rule changes can fundamentally alter how our markets operate. Companies taking their money and buying back stock may not seem any different to companies taking their money and paying out dividends, but it means that to actually get money out of shares, people eventually need to sell them. Now, companies are theoretically only supposed to buy back their own shares when they think that they are undervalued in the market. But company management has figured out this weird trick where they can just always say that their company is undervalued and use these buybacks to boost the share price. And since their compensation is also usually tied to stock performance, it's a win-win. Today, this has created a situation that would be almost funny if it wasn't so concerning. A record number of CEOs are claiming that their company stock is undervalued, so they are doing big share buybacks. But then at the same time, they are personally cashing out record amount of their own stock at a price that they themselves have claimed is undervalued. For a lot of senior executives with performance-based pay, it simply makes sense to put a few good months on the books and liquidate as quickly as possible, because if they can do that, they will never need to work again. Back when CEO pay was more modest and not as performance-based, the goal was instead to hold on to an executive job for as long as possible. The pay was still really good, but you couldn't live off the bonus that came from one good quarter. So if you wanted to become truly wealthy, you needed to spend at least a decade in the top job, and to do that, you needed to make sure your company would run smoothly for that decade. Today, pay for top executives is so high that after 1 or 2 good years, they can cash out their equity holdings and not really need the job anymore. Ironically, when they do sell their shares, the person they are most likely selling to is their own company. Stock buybacks have become so widespread and been driven to such an extreme level that companies buying their own stock now accounts for basically all net buying activity in the market, and then some. According to the Federal Reserve's Z1 financial accounts, since the year 2000, households, foreign investors, and pension funds have on net actually sold about $300 billion more in stock than they have purchased. The inflow in capital has come exclusively from the $5.5 trillion in net purchases made by the corporations themselves. This whole game has starved genuine reinvestment into business activity because it's far more rewarding to just directly influence their own stock price. Now again, eventually this will cause problems, especially amongst the growing list of companies that have taken on debt to buy their own stock. But most shareholders simply don't care about the long term because they are now holding onto their stock for less than a year on average. This trend has been accelerated a little bit by low-cost brokerages like Robinhood, but those people don't actually own enough of the market to have an influence this significant. The real driver of this is that large stockholders need to liquidate their positions to generate any kind of cash flow. Over the last 5 years in particular, we have witnessed a strange trend develop from this little game. People aren't making profit by running profitable businesses. They are making a profit by flipping assets that could eventually one day be profitable. A big determinant of how much these businesses are worth is interest rates. Cheap debt means borrowing to invest is easier, and it means that cash flow becomes less important in the short term. What this has done has turned bad news into good news. In the past, something like bad job numbers would spook the market because if people don't have jobs, they can't buy stuff from businesses. And if businesses can't sell their stuff, they won't be profitable. But that way of thinking is very outdated in today's market. Today, bad job numbers means that the Fed might be forced to lower interest rates, which is way better for asset prices than something silly like genuine underlying business demand. Now, it's easy to just point at these companies and their executives and conclude that they are everything wrong with the world, or at the very least, the economy. But that's also not very productive. If we are being really honest with ourselves, if you or I got given a job as a Fortune 500 CEO and we could secure a generational fortune by doing some share buybacks, we would probably do it. I mean, I know I would. Feel free to pretend you are better than me though in the comment section below. The point is that all of this was simply the result of a few changes in rewards and regulations. People at all levels are overwhelmingly going to act in ways that conform to these guidelines. Yes, some groups and industries are really testing the limits of what is legal at the moment, but that's a separate issue. The bigger problem is that everything covered in this video so far is perfectly legal. Yes, we can absolutely do a better job of punishing people who fall outside these regulations when they do happen. But we also should not rely on people foregoing obvious personal rewards just because it's the right thing to do for society at large. The logical endpoint of all this is a financial product built entirely around kicking the cost as far into the future as humanly possible. 50-year mortgages will effectively double the total interest people pay on their homes, they will undermine equity accumulation, it will make the housing market more rigid than it already is, introduce significant structural risks to the financial system. Oh, and this whole thing will just make homes more expensive than they already are. The average first-time homebuyer is now 40 years old. Adding on a 50-year mortgage at that age means that statistically, people will still be making their payments 11 years after they are dead. This is not to mention that if we still really thought it was worth trying, other countries have already done that for us, and the results were pretty disastrous. Now, you probably already knew all of these issues, but the problems that come with a 50-year mortgage go much, much deeper than this, and this raises two important questions. If 50-year mortgages are such a threat to our economic system, then how exactly did we decide that 30 years was the ideal? But perhaps the more important question is, if this is so obviously a dumb idea, who stands to profit the most by making it happen? So we have to get the obvious stuff out of the way first. And the biggest issue of all is that 50-year mortgages won't make homes more affordable. In fact, they will probably do the opposite. In a perfect world, being able to spread your payments out over an extra 20 years should lower your monthly payment. But even with the optimistic numbers, the difference would not be nearly as large as you might expect. Assuming a very competitive 6% interest rate on a $320,000 loan used to buy a $400,000 house, your monthly payment on a 30-year mortgage would be $1,919. If, however, you could spread that out over 50 years, then your monthly payments would fall to $1,685, a savings of $235 a month, which is not that much for almost doubling the total loan term and the amount of interest you will pay over the life of the loan. Most people have just pointed to this simple arithmetic and written the whole thing off as a big waste of time. But to play devil's advocate and give this the best possible chance of making some sense, some people will try to make the argument first that if you take those monthly savings and invest them into the stock market, your returns could be higher than your interest payments, letting you profit off the difference and putting you in a better financial situation later in life. Right now, less wealthy households overwhelmingly have their wealth tied up in their home. Of course, poorer households are less likely to own their own home, but they are even less likely to own a significant amount of financial assets. If people actually took these monthly savings and invested them diligently into the stock market, then not only could it theoretically improve the balance of wealth amongst lower income households, it could also make it easier for first-time buyers to get into the market in the first place. $235 a month invested over 50 years could be $3.7 million assuming historic market rates of return, which is over 10 times more than the additional interest a borrower would pay on their 50-year mortgage. However, that is if absolutely everything went perfectly. And I already know what all of you live streamers are saying to your chatters right this very second. Almost nobody taking out a 50-year mortgage is going to have this level of financial discipline. The reason I even bothered with the devil's advocate shtick at all is because if these financial products do come to market, this is exactly how they are going to be sold to people. You aren't signing yourself up for multi-generational debt. You are arbitraging the time value of money. Optimistically, people are just going to take the money that would have gone to repayments and use it to cover other areas of their household budget. Now this is optimistic because at least a bit of extra spending might contribute to economic activity. Realistically, all this is going to do is increase house prices by stimulating demand just like it has every single other time we have tried this. In just last week's video, we saw how longer and looser auto financing has made cars more expensive. The only reason why college kids with no income can pay for tuition that has outpaced inflation by 400% is because it's become so easy to take out student debt. More recently, everyday items have been allowed to inflate further than they might have otherwise been able to, with a little help from all kinds of weird and wonderful consumer credit. And yeah, even 50-year mortgages were introduced in Japan in the 1980s to assist with housing affordability. All it did was make real estate even more expensive, contributing to their record housing bubble. But that's fine, because it all ended super well for them, and their economy has been thriving ever since. So yeah, we may not like to admit it, but we have probably dug ourselves into the same kind of hole. For now, if we actually genuinely just wanted to make homes more affordable for first-time homebuyers, 15-year mortgages would probably do more good than 50-year mortgages in the long term, but more on that later. As for the benefits to first-time homebuyers, this is also ignoring the other costs that come with owning a home like property taxes, maintenance, and insurance, which means the total month-to-month savings will be even more marginal than even the optimistic estimates would suggest. It's also conveniently ignoring the fact that longer loans will probably attract higher interest rates from lenders, effectively eliminating the month-to-month savings for most people. From the numbers alone, this looks like a bad idea on top of a bad idea on top of a bad idea. And to be fair, most policymakers have acknowledged this and tried to distance themselves from this plan. But there are still two big reasons why we might end up seeing these loans anyway. They are going to make a lot of money for the right people, and we may be out of other options. Alright, so behind most bad ideas is either a profit motive or some level of desperation, and you don't need to tighten the tinfoil hats too tightly to see both of those elements here. The current proposal to introduce 50-year mortgages came from a meeting between the president and the Federal Housing Finance Agency director, Bill Pulte. The FHFA was established in 2008 after the global financial crisis to keep a tighter leash on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the semi-government enterprises tasked with buying up mortgages off regular banks provided they meet strict criteria regarding lending standards. Theoretically, you could walk into your local Wells Fargo today and ask for a 50-year mortgage, and as a private business, there is nothing specifically stopping them legally. However, at the moment, these loans are extremely rare for two reasons. The first is that 50-year mortgages do not currently fit within the underwriting criteria of Fannie or Freddie Mac. So if the bank gives that loan, they can't sell it off to these organizations, and instead they have to keep it on their books for the next 50 years. Compared to a regular 30-year mortgage, which they can make a quick, easy profit on overnight, this kind of deal just doesn't make business sense, except for maybe rare instances of extremely large loans to private banking clients. However, if the Federal Housing Finance Agency instructed Fannie and Freddie to start accepting 50-year loans as well, then that would be the first barrier removed. The second reason why private banks don't do this for now is because 50-year terms are outside the bounds of what the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau considers a qualified mortgage. Qualified mortgages just means that banks meet some basic requirements to satisfy the Bureau that their lending is not predatory. If they do meet these criteria, they are offered legal safe harbor, which makes the banks harder to sue if the mortgage goes tits up. For now, loan terms beyond 30 years do not meet these criteria, which means if you get given a 50-year mortgage and end up in financial hardship, you could theoretically take your bank to court for predatory lending and they would have far fewer legal protections. Now, they would still have an army of lawyers, so please don't try it just because someone on the internet said it was theoretically possible. Anyway, this might not matter soon because the government is currently pushing to dismantle the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau anyway by cutting off its funding. This would remove the last barrier to 50-year loan terms, and if banks are allowed to write these loans, there is a big incentive to do so. Longer loan terms are more valuable when they are turned into mortgage-backed securities because they pay interest for an additional 20 years. Longer loan terms will most likely also enable slightly larger loans, maximizing bank revenue. Now remember, the Federal Housing Finance Agency back up here was specifically created after the subprime mortgage crisis to try and stop the whole system from getting too crazy again. So then why would they be pushing for riskier loans that are going to make the market more unstable? Well, we may never know. But on a completely unrelated note, the current director of the FHFA, Bill Pulte, is one of the heirs to the Pulte Group, the third largest real estate development company in America. He is also the founder of Pulte Capital Partners, a separate private equity firm he started in 2011, which according to their website makes focused investments into construction-focused businesses like roofers, HVAC installers, and drywallers. That means both the family business and the private equity firm are reliant on people buying and selling homes to generate returns, and that's a problem because home sales have cratered since interest rates have risen. New buyers can't afford to break into the market, and existing homeowners don't want to sell their homes after they locked in low interest rates. Now, if 50-year mortgages become commonplace, they would only make our current predicament significantly worse for future generations down the road. If people can lock in good rates for 30 years, that can cause problems. But eventually, they build up equity, and for the final 15 years of their loan, their nominal interest rate is not as big of a deal. However, if people lock in a 50-year mortgage at a good interest rate, they will build up equity in their home far more slowly, which means that the current rigidity of the market could be extended for the length of an entire generation. However, that will be a problem for a generation that isn't even born yet. And obviously, it should go without saying, screw those guys. We have problems to fix right now. Today, even those households that were lucky enough to lock in low interest rates on normal terms are starting to struggle. The true extent of financial hardship in the housing market has become incredibly hard to track because of a trend that is being dubbed extend and pretend. Basically, lenders have allowed borrowers to defer or renegotiate their payment schedules quietly behind the scenes without officially noting them down as delinquent payments. They extend their loan terms and pretend everything is okay. Now, for the lenders, it could be argued that some repayments are better than no repayments, but for the financial system as a whole, we truly don't have reliable data on how dire our situation is. For home builders and financiers, this is a real problem. But one way to get things moving again would be to make financing terms even more flexible. A 50-year loan is effectively just officially sanctioned market-wide extend and pretend. This could be sold as helping out new buyers break into the market, but the people who it will help the most are existing investors. One of the biggest problems with real estate around the world is that modern homes have become assets first, with a side hustle in accommodating humans as a distant second priority. This is because they are one of, if not the single most effective vessels for finance and tax incentives. You can't borrow money on a government-backed 30-year fixed interest term to buy stocks, nor can you claim any of the dozens of deferments, incentives, or credits that come with real estate. When it comes to reining in house prices to address affordability concerns, most people can only spend as much as they can borrow. So by restricting how much they can borrow, policymakers can easily influence home prices while also making the financial system more robust. A study on Swedish home prices found that properties become markedly more affordable after the regulators cut back on interest-only loans and introduced strict amortization schedules. A global study by the Bank of International Settlements found a similar trend across countries. If we really wanted to make homes more affordable, 15-year mortgages would do a lot more than 50-year mortgages. But that's kind of the point. Because real estate has become such an institutionalized investment vehicle, one man's affordable home is another man's crippling market crash. On one hand, 50-year mortgages are only going to make things worse by making homes even more attractive as an investment vehicle. But on the opposite side of that same coin, 50-year mortgages could help to keep a fundamentally broken market from collapsing on itself, even if only for a few extra months. Over the last 5 years, institutional investors have drawn a lot of scrutiny for quietly buying up hundreds of billions of dollars in residential real estate across the country, particularly in areas like the Sun Belt. Today, they are quietly trying to back out of those same investments because the markets they went all in on did not continue to attract the same volume of new entrances they were projecting. As I was putting this video together, Atriok did a fantastic interview with Melody Wright, one of the top housing market experts in America who has effectively been saying the same thing. Now, I will leave a link to that full interview because it's worth a watch. But to summarize, the housing market is shaking, so institutional investors with thousands of properties want to dump their holdings onto Airbnb bros with dozens of properties. But the only way they are going to be able to do that is if it becomes easier to qualify for big loans. And the only way to get those is if big loans are sold as a way to help regular people who just want to buy a single home to live in. Unfortunately, this market has become so large that they are effectively too big to fail. Actually letting homes become affordable too quickly would present a systemic risk to the entire financial system. Unfortunately, one group has to feel the pain. And it's just much easier when that group is the people who aren't yet balancing huge piles of debt and overinflated assets. So when one group keeps quietly getting handed the bill for everyone else's comfort, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that things have started to feel a little bit extreme. The word unprecedented is seeing an unprecedented amount of use in the world at the moment. Its prevalence has roughly quadrupled over the last 2 decades. In 2022, it was Oxford's Word of the Year, and since then, it seems like everything, everywhere is unprecedented. Now, obviously, the internet is not afraid to use a little bit of hyperbole and emotive language to drive clicks or panic purchases, but there is more to it than that. Within just the last month, France, Japan, and Lithuania all had their prime ministers resign in varying levels of disgrace. Nepal's was literally chased out of his country, and Brazil sentenced their former president to 27 years in prison. Mass protests are taking place right now in the UK, Spain, Italy, Siberia, Indonesia, Angola, Slovakia, and France, although that last one may be more newsworthy if they weren't protesting. The new richest man in the world, Larry Ellison, made more money in a single day than any person in history. And now, he and the number 2 spot, Elon Musk, are currently worth more than every billionaire in the world was back in the year 2000. And of course, last week's headlines were dominated by stories of political violence. Now, this channel is not about the world's problems. It's about business, finance, and economics. Unfortunately, that's exactly the point. People who are financially comfortable are not normally this discontent. You can blame this all on whatever particular politician or group you don't like, but they are a symptom of wider problems, not the origin. The unprecedented trend of unprecedented trends is longer and wider than any single person's influence, and it's showing up in more places than you realize. Debt, inequality, fraud, political polarization, rhetoric, influence, wealth, corruption, even stuff like video games. If you are playing online for some silly reason like fun, prepare to get dunked on by someone trying to make it their career. Everything is seemingly more extreme than it has ever been before. So the question is, why? The best place to start this very brief summary of the escalation of everything is with video games. I promise I haven't gone completely insane here. They are genuinely microcosms of some of the biggest problems in the world in 3 simple ways. Like a lot of other things over the last 20 years, the video game industry has become a lot larger and a lot more profitable. According to data from the market research firm Inkwood, revenue from video games is now 3 times higher than revenue from film and music combined. Publishers have become much better at getting more people onto their games, and getting more out of them while they are there. But you probably already knew all of that, and honestly, an industry just getting bigger isn't a problem by itself. But you have probably also noticed that a lot of games just don't feel as fun anymore. And one of the reasons why is that it has become very competitive in the worst way possible. There is the all-too-real joke that if you sit down to play an online video game after a long, hard day of work, you are inevitably going to be matched up against someone with 700 APM and the reaction time of a Jedi, who consumes nothing outside of their IV drip and G Fuel. This is kind of a joke, but it's actually not wrong. A paper published by Cambridge and Microsoft Research discovered this problem all the way back in 2006. About 2% of players in most competitive games at the time, like Halo Combat Evolved, were so much better than the general population of gamers that they would ruin the online experience of anybody else they were matched up with. This initial research formed the foundation of skill-based matchmaking in a lot of games today, but follow-up research has found a problem. The best players are getting even better. Now, this has happened for a few reasons. As the industry has developed, it has turned from a fun little distraction into something that a lot of people can make a career out of. Not just from selling games, but from competing in them either directly through esports or indirectly through streaming. People like to watch other people that are highly skilled in their area of interest, but this natural global comparison has also made it easier to see exactly how the most competitive people are playing, slowly raising the bar for everybody. Not to sound too old here, but back in my day, the closest thing we had to competitive feedback was that rumor about using strength on a specific truck. Anyway, the point is that today, by comparison, anybody who is interested can learn how the world's most competitive people play, and at least try to copy it. For the people that can't, there are always unauthorized cheats, which it may not surprise you to learn, have also become far more common, and multiple studies have suggested a reason why. A lot of people, especially a lot of young men, are finding it increasingly difficult to excel in typical areas of life. So games become an outlet for self-actualization, where they can actually excel within a narrow social outlet amongst even a small group of peers with a similar interest. Unfortunately, as games have also become more globally competitive, it's driven a lot of people to cheat in order to maintain their status in what small ways they can. Of course, another reason why video game comparisons have become so profitable is that they are also willing to sell those same advantages to people who want to take the slightly more legit route. The same research has found that the majority of microtransactions done within online games were not purchased to enhance the user experience, but instead they were made to gain acceptance and recognition from their peers within these self-contained communities. A 2023 research report even found that it was better to sell items that gamers could grind for if they had the time and skills, because that way, if they instead just paid for the items, their friends would have no way of knowing and would assume that they were just really good at the game. Put another way, if you can sell a sense of pride and accomplishment to people who can't find it anywhere else, you have a very profitable business model on your hands. But alright, I hear what you are saying. Intensifying global competition, financial exploitation, and the development of very cheap but narrow micro-communities, all supported by the rise of cheating, abusing exploits, pay to win, and the hyper-optimization of everything, that's just gaming. What's that got to do with the big problems in the world? By looking at the numbers alone, someone might reasonably conclude that, all things considered, the world is actually in a pretty good spot right now. Poverty is down across the world, living standards are up, and apart from some isolated examples, the world is actually relatively peaceful. Even on issues closer to home, like our job market being a hot steaming mess, I would still personally rather deal with ghost jobs, AI anxiety, and office politics than spend 16 hours a day operating a Victorian-era limb remover for 3 shillings and a Christmas Traburker bonus. So then maybe we should actually just listen to the boomers telling us to stop complaining and just enjoy the relative golden age we live in, right? The fact that a few core aspects of our everyday lives have undeniably become much better over the past 80 years is actually a really important ingredient in the unrest we are seeing today. But before we get to that, we need to consider it alongside another ingredient: the media. It's tempting to conclude that the media is just making everything sound worse than it is because outrage, fear, and vindication sell subscriptions and drive clicks more than a level-headed discussion about how things are actually kind of okay. But that's only half true. The traditional media hasn't just now figured out that big scary headlines are good at selling newspapers. They have been doing this for a really long time. If anything, back in the good old days, they arguably hyped up stories even more. Yeah, you were probably sick of every single little scandal in the world being dubbed Coldplaygate, Donutgate, Signalgate, Deflategate, Beergate, or the least creative of all, Gatesgate. As someone who mostly makes content about broken business structures and misaligned incentives in the financial industry, it would be mighty hypocritical of me to not acknowledge that sometimes dull but important content matter needs an exciting headline to get people to care about it. In fact, over the last week, I've been using all of you as little guinea pigs to prove this point. I took last month's video on private equity and ran an A/B test using 2 different titles. One was a typical interest-building title, and the other was very plain and descriptive. Unsurprisingly, the first option absolutely crushed the second. Oh yeah, and as an aside, this tool is the reason why you probably noticed the same video from bigger creators being shown to you with 20 different combinations of titles and thumbnails. But anyway, the thing is, if the actual Watergate happened today, it wouldn't be a year-long scandal like it was in the 70s. It would probably remain in the news cycle for about a week before people got bored or the next big thing came along. If you don't believe me, I am going to show you a chart that might make you lose faith in the attention span of the general public. Yeah. What this means is that if anything, individual media outlets are not making as big of a deal of events as they would have in the past. However, there are also a lot more outlets in total. The comedian Tim Minchin probably said it best, that opinions are like apples, and that everybody has one. What he left out, because it was a speech at a college, is that most of them also aren't worth looking into. The internet and social media in particular has democratized the megaphones that people can use to get attention, so naturally it's become a bit noisy. In such an environment, sometimes the only way to stand out is to have a take that is more extreme than everybody else. Thanks to engagement-based algorithms, you are mostly going to be fed a diet of 2 particular content dishes. The first is people telling you stuff that you want to hear and already agree with. And the second is caricatures of the other side that are so unbearably dumb that it reinforces your beliefs. Our monkey brains really hate having our ideas genuinely challenged, so platforms that just want people to spend time on them don't present challenges. The most profitable way to deliver information is to turn it into a personalized propaganda department. That's always been true. Technology has simply made it possible. Ideas in such a setting are allowed to go a lot further than they would have with a wider audience that could give some pushback. So yeah, new technology is hijacking our mental weaknesses, and traditional media coverage is just desperately trying to stay relevant in the attention economy. I know these changes probably aren't shocking you, but so far this is all ignoring the most important point of all. The world has become more extreme. We live in objectively the best period of history ever, but these last 80 years have been an exception rather than the rule. They have been defined by exponential economic development and a relatively egalitarian system that has valued and rewarded human labor. We had a lot of economic tailwinds, like a large young population that has received a good education, women entering the workforce for the first time in mass, effectively doubling the labor pool, new technologies, and an abundant supply of easy energy from fossil fuels. A lot of these perks basically let us play Global Sim City on easy mode for a few glorious decades. But now, a lot of those same issues are working against us. The labor market has become ultra-competitive. Fossil fuels are coming with unexpected debuffs, and new technologies are getting more expensive to develop while providing more questionable benefits to society. The biggest technology companies of the last decade have effectively been dedicated to replacing existing industries by skirting regulations with an app instead of building new industries from scratch. Human labor has also just become easier to replace. I don't even mean this in a "they took our jobs" way.
Oh, they took our jobs! They took your jobs!
They took your job! Took your job!
As technology has become more user-friendly, it has become easier to replace people in basic roles without having to worry about a lengthy retraining process. And speaking of an abundant labor force, those young, well-educated workers in the past have also turned into old, wealthy retirees today who are largely unwilling to give up any of their comforts or power to keep the system going. This goes all the way to the very top with some of the oldest leaders in history who have one last chance to get into the history books and aren't going to be around for the consequences of their actions. But go and watch this extended cut video next to find out why it is so hard to actually tax the billionaires at the very top. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.